Welcome everyone. It has been a while. Today we are going to be looking at the Tome of Leo, uh, a kind of a thorough theological analysis of the Tome of Leo. Uh, this is one of the most prevalent documents, one of the most popular documents that is talked about in the Christian world today. But what is very interesting is that it is talked about its effects on the world has been talked about, but what it is about has not been talked about at all. It's something you see very rarely discussed, especially in modern apologetics. It's used for two purposes. So if you hear someone talk about the Tome of Leo, they're doing it for two purposes. Either they're trying to prove papal supremacy, which is very strange because the Tome has no mention of it, right? It is a theological document. It is not an ecclesiological document of any sort. Or it is used to attack Chalcedonian Christianity that it supposedly teaches Nestorianism, right? Those are the two reasons why people bring this tome up. Well, I want to be the third reason. I want to bring up this tome because it genuinely does have very important, extremely important theological insights that the Christian world in general has forgotten. But this is especially for Saint Sophronius of Jerusalem, who was very influential in the Sixth Ecumenical Council. This was one of the very important documents that he used in defense of the correct Christology in regards to Christ, especially in regards to the two wills in Christ. So let's start this video by first talking about some of the very popular myths about the tome. What those myths are: the idea that the tome is a dogmatic statement, which is true, but then it was believed everywhere at any time, and there was no problem with trying to push it, right? That it settled the dispute at Chalcedon, and you hear people usually quote, Peter has spoken through Leo, right? There's a statement in the Council of Chalcedon. We're going to be looking at the full statement, and that's going to be at like the last slide, so watch it until then. But we're going to be looking at that statement. We're going to show that actually it implies something completely different than what the Roman Catholics want you to think. In fact, it seems to imply exactly what the Orthodox believe in regards to ecclesiology. That the Tome of Leo is the basis of the Chalcedonian faith. That is that it's, it is in a way synonymous with the Chalcedonian Christological faith, or that it's the fundamental way that we look at it. This is a half truth. Again, we're going to be looking at in what ways they are true and what ways these myths are not true. Another myth, this is more of a monophysite myth, that the tome has some Nestorian undertones that needed to be corrected, and it was corrected in the Fifth Ecumenical Council. And that it only speaks about the two natures of Christ, and it doesn't really speak about anything else. It just says that Christ has two natures, and that's it, right? That's one of the main themes the tome deals with that people associate with it. But let's look at the reality, and I want to start with by pointing out a statement from the fourth session of the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon, where the most glorious officials in the exalted Senate in unison said, since we see the divine gospels displayed by our devoutness, let each of the most devout bishops assembled state if the definition of the 318 fathers who met formally at Nicaea, and of the 150 who convened subsequently in the imperial city, that means the Second Ecumenical Council, is in harmony with the letter of the most devout Archbishop Leo. So this is in reference to the Tome of Leo. In the fourth session, what was the basis of accepting the Tome of Leo? This shows you very clearly what it was. It's not that the Pope said so, therefore we must follow it, right? But whether it is in concordance, right? Whether it is consistent with the theology of the First and the Second Ecumenical Councils. That's the basis the tome was judged on, and it passed that judgment. Now let's look at certain realities instead about the tome. The tome was a letter to the Bishop of Constantinople at the time, which was Saint Flavian. So it really did not have a ex cathedra intention. Not that it even existed at the time, but it didn't really have that kind of an intention. It was more of a letter to Saint Flavian, who wrote a letter to Pope Saint Leo, and he attached the documents to the Home Synod, where Saint Flavian was telling Saint Leo about Eutyches and that Eutychus is a problem, and what is his thoughts. And Saint Leo just said, well, as the representative of the West, and as someone who represents the theology understood by the West, not that it is different from the East, I will give you my thoughts, because Saint Leo is not a theologian, right? Saint Leo is a great, obviously, is a great bishop, but he's not someone that's a theology pro, but rather he's someone that kind of just reflects and helps you try to understand how the West at that time understood Christ, right? That's what his tome is very important about. And we cannot really forget that. If we want to understand the tome, we can't really forget that. It did not settle the dispute, right? It had that intention, but it did not settle the dispute. And there are two very prevalent examples. One example is that this letter was sent to the Second Ephesian Council in 449, where Dioscorus received the letter, he read the letter privately, and then he acted as if the letter didn't exist. So obviously, there was someone, a bishop of Alexandria, that looked at that and didn't feel like he had to read it just because it was from the Pope. And for a good reason, because, for Dioscorus, this letter was very scandalous, as we will see in history. And the second point is in relation to that. It did not really settle anything. I mean, we can say that it was orthodox, we can say that it was true, but if you want to be honest with history, it didn't settle anything. I'm not going to say it caused, because the letter is not the cause of the schism, but the fact that there was a massive schism that was going underway that really finalized in the 6th century after the 5th Ecumenical Council showcases that there was no universal acceptance of the tome until the party that rejected it just schismed from the church itself, right? There was no acceptance from the tome universally. And in fact, really the East in general kind of oscillated between accepting it and then saying, oh, maybe it's a bit too extreme, right? I mean, that shows you, that historical fact shows you that this letter didn't really settle anything. And what happened afterwards was more confusion, more debates, and unfortunately more bloodshed. I'm saying bloodshed in mostly a symbolical way, right? As a matter of fact, even in the council itself, the tome was heavily debated. Okay? The Palestinian Illyrian bishops in the Council of Chalcedon debated the tome. They actually objected to the tome. They had many different objections to the Tome of Leo. And they taught that it was not orthodox. And this fact, right, I think both refutes the Roman Catholic and Oriental understanding of ecclesiology. Right after this objection, there was a 5-day commission handled by Anatolius of Constantinople, where he basically brought the bishops that had a problem with the tome. They spent 5 days cross-checking St. Cyril's statements with the tome. And this shows you another insight, that the basis of the orthodoxy of the tome was understood whether it was consistent with the Christology of St. Cyril of Alexandria, right? And 5 days later, the bishops that objected to it accepted it, right? They eventually said, okay, seems like this tome is indeed orthodox. And this shows you that the basis of Chalcedonian faith was whether it was consistent with St. Cyril of Alexandria's Christology. And the majority of the bishops viewed that council as a continuation of Cyril's Christology. The alleged Nestorianism, which we're going to be looking at in this analysis right now of the letter, it does not match up with reality. And this is a very important point. The tome is much more than just the two natures of Christ. It is not merely about the two natures of Christ. He's not just speaking of, oh, there are two natures in Christ, the end. But he's explaining how that is the case. And so he's not just saying there are two natures, but he's showing why exactly there has to be two natures in Christ. And this is a point I made in the first monophysite debate against Paul Ibrahim on Craig Trulia's channel, which is also on my channel, when I was asked by Kakish, he asked me, why, or I think Craig, one of the two asked me, why is the Tome of Leo so important, right? Why do we have to accept it? Like, why is it so important to you? And what point did I make? The point that I made is that it is much more than just the two natures. It is also about two energies in Christ, the source of the energies, the activities of Christ, and that Christ has two wills. It is actually one of the most important documents in Christological history that one needs to accept in order to fully accept the complete divine and human reality in Christ. And we're going to be looking at in what way it does that. But some people might ask, this view that you're proposing, David, that the tome is about two energies as well, it just doesn't make sense, right? Some people might say it just doesn't make sense. When I read the tome, I don't see the term energy. I don't see the term activity. What are you talking about? Well, a good way to prove that this is how it is seen, we can look at it from the liturgy of the Orthodox Church. On the top left, you see a part of the, I think, the Matin service of the fathers of the sixth ecumenical council, not the sixth ecumenical council, but the sixth ecumenical council, right? Where it states that let him who does not confess Christ, the word of the Father, to be in two natures and activities fall under anathema. For thus did the fourth council of the Holy Fathers unanimously preach. And on the middle you have, this is from Christ in Christian Tradition by Aloy Grillmeyer. He points out in various cases where Dioscorus opposes the Tome of Leo because it speaks of two energies. And it is not only Dioscorus, but also Damian, who was the bishop of Alexandria in the 6th century, speaks against the idea of there being two energies in Christ. And most importantly, Severus of Antioch, this is only from the first letter, but there are multiple different letters where he says the same thing, where he says that he anathematizes those that speak of two natures after the union and consequently apportioning the operations and properties between the natures, right? And so he's condemning those who speak of two energies and two properties, and that they are proper to nature. Again, he says this in multiple different letters. And so this opposition, and again, Saint Sophronius' main argument for the two wills of Christ is he cites the Tome of Leo, that he thinks that it implicitly talks about this. And so this, I think, is a very strong proof. It's a very strong proof that shows that the Christology of Saint Leo, at least, was perceived to be something more than just two natures, but it speaks of the two energies, right? And especially in apologetical debates in regards to essence energies distinction, a lot of people, they kind of cite the Sixth Ecumenical Council about proving that there's a doctrine of the divine energies in Orthodoxy, and I think the Sixth Council is a proof of that. I think the Seventh Council is also a proof of that, but I think really the Fourth Ecumenical Council is one of the biggest proofs of the doctrine of the divine energies, and that it is distinct from nature, because it is one of the main points of the tome. So here we see, I'm not going to be reading the entire tome. If you want to read it, you can read it at home yourself. What I'm more interested in, I want to read the critical parts, and I kind of want to give you the TLDR of each page. So in the first page, we can see here that Saint Leo kind of just, he kind of just says, I'm shocked that it took so long of a time that that the proceedings of the council was sent to me. It's kind of complaining. Then he kind of gives the Nicene creed in his own verse, like his understanding of it in regards to Christ. And he kind of makes some preliminary basic Christological statements to get his point across about the unity of Christ. And these are usually not really, how shall I say, these are not really debated. These are basic statements that most Christians, if not all, will agree wholeheartedly. I outlined the part where he says, if he had not assumed our nature and made it his own, he whom neither sin could defile nor death detain, for he was indeed conceived from the Holy Spirit in the womb of the Virgin Mother. So he's, this is from the Nicene Creed, who brought him forth with her virginity preserved, just as she conceived him while preserving her virginity. So he, like from the outset, he is kind of detaching himself from the Nestorian idea that the Theotokos is not the Theotokos, and he's basically saying that God's mother is the Virgin Mary, and he's kind of repeating the Nicene Creed. So again, you have scriptural quotations and so on and so forth. So this is one of the first statements that I think is very critical and important. He says that, with therefore the distinctive character of each nature being preserved and coming together into one person. So it's kind of critical to help understand what this really means. He's speaking of distinctive characters of each nature, which is kind of an argument I make all the time. It's a very simple argument that he's making. If in Christ there is a human reality and a divine reality, and they are of distinct characteristics, then there are two natures. That's kind of the simple argument that he's making. Christ is fully God and fully man. Therefore, he has fully the distinctive characters, but they are preserved in the one person of Christ. So they're not preserved in and of themselves, but they are preserved in relation to the hypostasis of Christ. And he moreover says that Christ is one and the same. One and the same is a statement he constantly uses in the Tome, and this is actually one of the best arguments against this Nestorian aspect of the Tome, supposed, right? Because one and the same, this is a very Cyrillian statement, and the whole point of that statement is that the pre-incarnate logos and the post-incarnate logos that is united with human nature they're the same exact person. There's no change between those persons. They're the same exact person, and there is no different person beside that. So it's a very simple statement. It's kind of, how should I say this? It is kind of a subtle way of saying that there is no other person and this is the same person. And that this one, the same person who is the mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. And this, if you're a Protestant watching this, this is usually a proof text Protestants use against, the idea of priests and whatnot, where they kind of say, well, what's the point of confessing to a priest? There's only one mediator, that's Christ. This biblical line, it's a Christological statement, right? It is not a statement about how you don't need anyone else to quote mediate. It's about how Christ is both fully God and fully man, and so he really is the full mediator between man and God, because all actions of God are done through him, and it is through Christ that we can see God the Father. That's the point of that statement. It's not making a ecclesiological statement. I mean, it is an ecclesiological statement because Christology and ecclesiology are very intricately connected. I'm not disputing that. What I am disputing is that 1 Timothy 2:5 is about ecclesia. It's not. It's about Christology primarily. And so St. Leo is using that statement in that respect. And that Christ, who's the mediator between God and man, will be able to die in respect of the one and will not be able to expire in respect of the other, right? And so he's kind of repeating the idea that death is proper to human nature. Now, it's not even proper to human nature because death is unnatural, but what he's kind of saying is that going through death is something that the human nature goes through, right? The divine nature, which is life itself, cannot ever die because God is all good, right? God is the good, right? There's no evil in God. So he's basically saying, death is something that human beings go through. And so Christ went through death because he was a human being. So he went through death in his human nature. Therefore, in the pure and perfect nature of true man and true God was born, complete in what is his own and complete in what is ours. We call ours that which the Creator deposited in us from the beginning and which we receive back again to restore. For that which the deceiver introduced in addition, and the man being deceived sinned. So he's kind of talking about how Christ is the inverse of Adam, right? Adam was deceived and therefore he sinned. Christ became sin to destroy sin. And then he speaks about Christ assuming the form of a servant without any defilement of sin. So he's speaking of Christ not having fallen human nature. This is a very, I'm surprised that there are so many people today that actually believe Christ assumed a fallen human nature. This is a very explicit statement that Christ did not assume fallen human nature. I'm genuinely shocked that there are even Orthodox Christians. I will expect this from Protestants. I will expect this from Roman Catholics. I don't expect this from Orthodox Christians. Saint Leo is completely against the idea that Christ had a fallen human nature, right? So he had no defilement of sin. He had a pre-fallen human nature. And pre-fall and post-fall, they don't refer to distinct human natures. I want to get that out of the way as well. But rather, they describe distinct conditions of the same human nature, right? So, one, the pre-fallen human nature is not corrupted by sin, but the post-fallen human nature does have corruption, right? But this corruption is not part of the human nature. That's why it's not inherently natural to human beings to die, because death is a consequence of sin. And this is another critical statement. We're approaching kind of the very controversial statements here in this document. He says, since that emptying truth which the invisible made himself visible, and the maker and master of the universe chose to become one among men, was a condescension of compassion and not a deficiency of power. I outlined this because, monophysites and other people, they don't have any problem with this statement, but this is a statement, this is a kind of understanding that most Unitarians and especially Muslims don't have, right? So one of the criticisms Muslims have is that God becoming man makes God deficient in power. And so St. Leo already responds to that accusation before Islam even existed in saying that it is a condescension of compassion, right? Christ, when he emptied himself, emptying himself doesn't mean that he emptied his divine nature and is not divine anymore. Rather that he took on the form of man, right? So he acquired a new mode of existence in a sense. And in this new mode is distinct from his divine nature. You can kind of understand this as the body-soul analogy, right? How, for example, the body is material, but the soul is immaterial. Likewise, the divine nature retains its characteristics. Again, this is something St. Leo said in the previous page. Both natures retain their characteristics. That is, Christ's divinity is not damaged, right? It is absolutely not damaged. It's not fused in any way. It's not damaged. It doesn't suffer anything, but rather the person of Christ took on the form. And so now, he has a mode in which he's immaterial in his divinity, but he has a mode in which he's material in his humanity. Similarly, how men are material in the form of our body, but we are immaterial in the form of our soul, right? So let's get to the statement. For each nature preserves without any loss its own distinctive character, and just as the form of God does not destroy the form of the servant, so the forming of the servant did not diminish the form of God. This is kind of a repetition of what the previous page said, but he's really reiterating the distinctive characteristics of each nature, right? And form and nature, in fact, both in the biblical sense and in the patristic sense, are synonyms. They basically mean the same thing. Especially in the West, form is seen as a synonym of nature, synonym of essence, right? It is not really understood as hypostasis, it's not really understood as person. And on the right side, I wanna point out, actually before I do that, he also says in the same page, therefore the Son of God enters this lowly state of the world, descending from his heavenly throne without being separated from the glory of the Father, born by a new order and a new birth, by a new order, because although invisible in what is his own, he became visible at our level, and although incomprehensible, he willed to be comprehended, and while remaining eternal, he began to be in time. And although master of the universe, he received a servile form. By the way, this is pretty much the same thing as Saint Athanasius says in On the Incarnation, I believe. He received a servile form. After veiling the greatness of his own Godhead, the impassible God did not disdain being a passible man, nor the immortal one to submit to the laws of death. This is a very critical statement because this is a theopaschite statement. Those who don't know what theopaschicism is, it's the idea that God suffered. Now, there are two understandings of theopaschicism. One of them is that the divine nature suffered, right? And this is heretical because the divine nature is impassible. It is beyond passibility, and so it is beyond suffering. It cannot suffer. It is straight up impossible for the divine nature to suffer because it is beyond that. Whereas suffering is proper to human nature, right? But he is saying that the immortal one, right? The passible man, but who is the immortal one, submitted to the laws of death, right? And so the quote here on the right side, this is according to Saint Leo, This is from Saint Ambrose Undefeated. Now I say according to Saint Leo because I have not found the quote on the right, which I'm about to read, from any source. The only source I found is from Saint Leo himself. He is quoting this from his one of his letters, which is called in common language the second tome. So it's one of it. I believe it's the letter 165. I might be wrong. It might be 165. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it should not be difficult to find this letter that I'm talking about. He is quoting Saint Ambrose, who says, hence in that statement which we read, namely that the Lord of Majesty was crucified. Lord of Majesty, that's a divine title. That refers to the divine nature. Let us think of him not as crucified in his majesty, right? So he's not crucified in his divine nature, but the same God, the same man, God through his divinity, man through the taking on of flesh, Jesus Christ, the Lord of Majesty, is said to have been crucified. Because sharing in both natures, that is the human and the divine, he endured the passion, the nature of man, so that without distinguishing, we may say that it is the Lord of Majesty who suffered, and as it is written, it is the Son of Man who has descended from heaven. Why am I quoting this? You might say that this is a forgery. You might say this letter doesn't exist. Pope St. Leo made it up. But the main point I'm making here is not dependent on whether this letter is real or not. The main point I'm making here is that Pope St. Leo quoted this letter. He thinks that this letter vindicates his position. He is quoting from a letter that explicitly says, Lord of Majesty, that God suffered, that God was crucified and suffered on the cross. That is an explicit Theopascite statement. This in a can't say that term. I have a very hard time with Q's and R's, so apologies. But this completely proves, and I think completely and absolutely proves, that Pope St. Leo believed that God, who took on human nature, suffered. And so this absolutely refutes one of the main monophysite polemics against the Orthodox position, which is that we supposedly, this is by the way an argument Severin Zealot made, not in my debate because he knew he will be refuted on that point, but this is an argument he made in the debate against Joseph Sweden, right? The fake Orthodox, old calendarist idiots who didn't know what they were talking about. He made this, you can listen to that debate, right? You can listen to that debate if you don't believe me. Severin Zealot explicitly says, show me a Chalcedonian father that that says God suffered on the cross. Here you go. Saint Leo, the man you hate himself, explicitly says that. And what did Paul Abraham respond to that with? Right? Because they're of the same party. And this is them admitting that they are wrong on this point. What did he say? He said, oh, well, Nestorians also say God suffered. So yeah, when you get refuted, just say, oh, it doesn't matter anyway. I mean, it's the same kind of lame Muslim argumentation from these people. But what we can see, a very critical point from Saint Leo, is that God suffered on the cross. But again, how did he suffer? Well, he suffered in his human nature, right? And this is one of the most controversial statements from the tome. Saint Leo says, for each form performs what is proper to it in communion with the other, the word achieving what is the word's, while the body accomplishes what is the body's. The one shines with miracles, while the other has succumbed to outrages. Just as the word is inseparable from equality with the glory of the Father, so the body has not abandoned the nature of our race. For one and the same is truly Son of God and truly Son of Man. God, in that the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Man, in that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Among us meme, right? People still make that joke. But the first thing I want to say is Saint Leo is merely quoting Pope Saint Sylvester here. Saint Sylvester, and this is from Leontius of Jerusalem's Against the Monophysites. This is from Saint Sylvester's work against the Jews. Saint Sylvester says, of the two natures united in him, one succumbs to injury, but the other is shown to be greater than any suffering. So this is a century before Saint Leo wrote this letter. He's kind of just repeating. Again, this is why I said Saint Leo is merely just repeating how the West understands Christology. This is one of those examples. And another thing is that the main argument here from the Monophysite party is that to speak of two forms especially the kind of wording that they don't like the wording at all, right? Uh, so the word achieving what is the words, as if that refers to the divine person, and then says the body accomplishes what is the bodies, as if that refers to a human person. I believe it is in the next slide. Yes, it is in the next slide. This kind of explains why this is said in detail. One of the reasons is, and this is Saint Sophronius' argument, is that in here Saint Leo is using grammatical predication, the predication of grammatical personhood to the natures, and this kind of sounds very iffy. Grammatical personhood, what does that even mean? If you read, and the funny thing is, my debate opponent Paul Ibrahim cited Hans von Loon's book, Saint Cyril of Alexandria, the Theophysite Christology of Saint Cyril of Alexandria. The title is something like that. Hans von Loon in his book, very in a detailed manner, explains what grammatical subject means. But when I explained grammatical subject to Paul, he did not understand what I was talking about. So it kind of cast doubt whether he even read that book. But that's a debate that happened a long time ago. The point that I'm making here is that it's completely valid to predicate natures as if they are grammatical persons. Now, what is a grammatical person? A grammatical person just means a person in writing. So all ontological real persons are grammatical persons, but not all grammatical persons are ontological persons. And I want to illustrate to you a great example that will no doubt help a lot of you understand what is being referred to here. Let's say I'm writing a poem and I'm trying to say that I'm very sad, and I say, my soul is in deep despair and sadness, right? What did I just do here, right? I just made my soul a person in writing, right? I gave some personal characteristics to my soul. By doing so, am I saying that my soul is a person? Not necessarily, right? If I said that my flesh hungers for bread, right, for the bread of life, I mean, it seems like my body has his own personal agency where he desires something, but that doesn't mean that I genuinely believe that. I might just be saying that in a poetic or a symbolical way. And so, likewise, when St. Leo is talking about two forms doing what is proper to each other, he is merely saying that Christ, the same person, is doing divine things in a divine way and human things in a human way, right? And that those actions are proper to their two natures. And what is more important, this is something that we're going to be looking at further in the tome as well, is that he's trying to prove how Christ is two natures here, first of all. He's responding to Eutychianism, which Eutychius had a very confused monophysite Christology. That's, admittedly not the same kind of Christology as Severus of Antioch or whatnot, or even Dioscorus, even though he defended him. His Christology was very confused, right? He believed in some kind of mixture, but St. Leo is trying to showcase that Christ has two natures because he has divine and human activities. That's really his main intention here. And so in St. Leo's mind, he kind of says to himself, if I prove to this guy, if I showcase to this guy that Christ has divine activities and human activities, then it should be very evident that he therefore has two natures. It should not be a dispute, and that this is inherently biblical language. And one of the other points in this page I quoted from, which I believe it's a Catholic evangelical journal, where it makes a comment on the tome in Greek, that each form does, which morphe energy, right? So the tome in Greek translation uses the term energy. That which is proper to it in concord with the other. In addition, the document goes on to state that each nature wills and performs the things that are proper to it in a communion with the other. And in accord with this reasoning, we hold that two natural wills and principles of action meet and corresponds for the salvation of the human race. And I believe that's from Saint Sophronius, but it's kind of, this argument is kind of making the point that I'm making. Another argument that Saint Sophronius makes, that the formula of Leo is incompatible with Nestorianism for two reasons. First, because the two natures worked not in separation from, but in communion with each other. And secondly, which perhaps follows from the first, because despite the fact that there are two working natures, there are not two, but only one working person. And the term each form doing what is proper to in communion with the other is very important. It's a very important term. It refers to the communication of idioms, communicatio idiomatum, or exchange of properties. That's another term people use, where the energies of humanity and divinity, the energies of divinity, engulf and interpenetrate humanity, the humanity of Christ. And so the divine glory can be dispensed, can really truly exist in Christ's humanity, and can be dispensed via his humanity even. This is exactly why we can participate, right? This is referring to the participation of man in God's divine energies. And this is how, as St. Athanasius says, man can become like God by participating in the divine grace of God that now inheres in our nature, that is now united to the divine nature via the person of Christ, and how we can really truly be properly saved. And that is by participating in God's divine energies. Notice how these beliefs are interconnected web of beliefs, right? You have one and it directly implies the other. So you can have a connection, a consistent connection in regards to the theology of Saint Leo and Saint Athanasius in this case. But he speaks more on this topic later on. And then he kind of speaks about the crucifixion of Christ and how it is in its either proper nature. But then he kind of makes a statement that is very similar to the statement here. He says, nevertheless, that because of which the outrage is common in both is one thing, and that because of which the glory is common is another. For he has from us the humanity that is less than the Father, and he has from the Father the Godhead that is equal with the Father. And actually, I want you to make it a mental note just for a couple of seconds before, because I kind of missed another argument I wanted to make, is in footnote 57, it says that the two passages are John 10:30 and 14:28 that St. Leo quotes, which is, I believe, or to be hung on the cross and to shake all the elements, change from night to day, or to be pierced with the nails and to open the gates of paradise to the fate of the thief. So also it is not of the same nature to say, right? This is the key statement here. It is not of the same nature to say I and the Father are one, and to say my Father is greater than I. So Saint Leo is, in different words, he's basically saying, I and the Father, the statement I and the Father are one refers to his divine communion with the Father, and my Father is greater than I refers to his human nature, right? And Timothy A. Luris, his response is, it belongs to the same nature to say my Father and I are one, and my Father is greater than I. It is the eternal Word who, in the human nature he makes his own, becomes less than the Father. No, he's not saying that. Sorry. So his quote is, "My Father and I are one, and my Father is greater than I." That's what belongs to the same nature. So, to be fair to Timothy, I do think his statement is heretical. But to be fair to him, in his mind, he's trying to say that the same person is simultaneously equal to Father, while at the same time the Father being greater than him, right? So it's kind of trying to say that it is the same person. But the problem with Timothy's response, and in general the monophysite response to the Tome of Leo, is that the stuff Saint Leo says in his tome, it has been said by many different fathers in the past. I mean, this is very clear. Saint Gregory, the theologian, in his orations, and the Catholic Fathers in general, one of the things that they say is that I unfortunately don't have the oration in mind, but he says that it is proper for the humanity to be ignorant, while in his divinity he knows all, right? He's not saying that that Christ had a gnomic will or anything like that, but there are many examples. I've showed this in videos and articles as well. There are many different examples that you can illustrate and show that there are certain aspects of the human nature that are different from the divine nature. And so this is not really a controversial statement from Saint Leo. It's kind of just seems like Timothy is just trying to find something that is not there, right? And I also understand the argument that Timothy read him as saying that there are two persons, but um, there are examples of Timothy understanding, right, what we are actually trying to say, and he still rejects that. It's the same with Severus. So the kind of language disparity argument is totally illegitimate. There's various different examples. I don't have the time to go into this right now, but what I want to get back to the main point about that statement from Saint Leo in regards to that because of which the outrage is common in both is one thing, right? That statement. This was talked about between Saint Maximus the Confessor and Pyrrhus the Monothelites. Pyrrhus says there is nothing then which the natures and natural properties have in common. And Saint Maximus says nothing, save only the hypostasis of the same natures. For just as he was without confusion in the hypostasis of his two natures, so he was without division in the union of his two natures. And Pyrrhus questions that, and he says, what? Do the fathers whose doctrines constitute the law, the rule, the glory, and the pride of the church, do they not say that from which comes the common glory is one thing, and that from which comes the common humiliation is another? So Pyrrhus is quoting from the Tome of Leo. Look at how St. Maximus understands the Tome of Leo. He says the Holy Father said this in reference to the mode of the exchange of attributes, right? Communicatio idiomatum. As is clear from the previous statement, the exchange does not concern one but two things and different kinds of things. According to the exchange, the natural attributes of the two parts of Christ are exchanged according to the ineffable union without a change or mixture of the natural principles. So the natures retain their natural principles. However, the energies of the two natures, engulfed one another, right? So the divine, and more properly speaking, the divine nature engulfed, uh, the divine energies engulfed the human operations, so to speak. Thus, if you say that there is a common will by the mode of exchange, then thou art really saying that there is not one will, but two wills. So once again, thine ingenious argument brings thee back to the position that thou tried to avoid. And he's kind of referring to, this is also in reference to one of the proof texts, both monothelites and diothelites at the same time used from St. Gregory the Theologian, who speaks of the one divine will of Christ and the other will of Christ that is deified, right? So the monothelites say that because the human will is deified, it is basically, right, it does not have its natural characteristic of human will. Whereas St. Maximus says, no, it actually proves that there is a human will. It is just that the human will has become a participant of the divine will, of the divine energies. That's the point that St. Maximus the Confessor is making. And later on, Pyrrhus then says, how? Was not the flesh moved by the decision of the Word who is united with it? Right? So Pyrrhus is actually making a monophysite argument here. And St. Maximus responds to him by saying, you divide Christ by talking like this. For Moses and David, and as many as were susceptible to the influence of the divine energies, were moved by his command, and laid aside human and fleshly properties. But following all the holy fathers in this, as in all things, we say, since the God of all has himself become man without change, it follows that the same person not only willed appropriately as God in his Godhead, but also willed appropriately as man in his humanity. For the things that exist came to be out of nothing, and have therefore a power that impels than to hold fast to existence, and not to non-existence, which power is simultaneously an inclination towards that which naturally maintains them in existence, and a drawing back from things destructive to their existence. And I could read the rest, but I think if you read the Disputation with Pyrrhus, you'll kind of understand more of what is being said here. But to kind of plainly say what I'm trying to get at is that Saint Leo is, as Saint Maximus is saying, talking about a real, genuine union. So the distinction that he has from the Nestorian position, especially, is that for Nestorians, the exchange of properties is only verbal, right? At most, it can only be verbal. It cannot genuinely be real. Whereas we, as Orthodox, and Saint Leo himself says, no, it is not merely verbal. The exchange of properties, the communion of the two natures with each other, is real, right? It is a real natural union. And this is one of the aspects of the Tome of Leo, the theology of Saint Leo, that completely contradicts Nestorian Christology. And this is why this kind of polemic, this empty polemic that the Tome of Leo is Nestorian, this is one of the other examples why it's not the case here. In this page, one of the more important statements is where he kind of repeats the principle exchange of properties. He's quoting from 1 Corinthians 2:8, where he says, "Whence it is that in the creed itself we all acknowledge the only begotten Son of God crucified and buried, according to that apostolic saying, for if they had known, they will not have crucified the Lord of glory." As Richard Price, this is from, if you didn't know, by the way, these pages are from the Acts of the Council of Chalcedon translated by Richard Price, and so the footnotes are his as well. He understands that Saint Leo is expounding the principle of communicatio idiomatum, according to which the union of the two natures is expressed by attributing to each nature the characteristics of the other. Right. This is why we can properly, as Orthodox Christians, say that God divinely suffered and was crucified, that the Lord of glory was crucified and suffered. This is also why, very importantly, we can refer to the Virgin Mother as Theotokos, because of the exchange of attributes, right? So it kind of reminds me of William Lane Craig, actually, who supposedly believes in Chalcedonian Christology, even though he's an Apollinarian. He rejects the idea of communicatio idiomatum because it will mean that the natures lose their properties, meaning that the human nature will then become omnipresent, but it's not omnipresent, therefore there is no exchange. I mean, that's what happens when you don't have a doctrine of the divine energies, by the way. You completely get a wrong understanding of the exchange of attributes. So how can Dr. Craig claim that the Virgin Mother is Theotokos? You can't. If you don't accept the exchange of properties, you can't accept that Mary is the Theotokos. That's the whole basis of the Virgin Mother being Theotokos, right? So the next page, Saint Leo says this is actually, I had many people kind of ask me about this statement. They kind of said, isn't this very Nestorian? This sounds very Nestorian, right? Some people have asked me, and it's a very seemingly difficult statement. Saint Leo says, "Let him consider which nature it was that, pierced by the nails, hung on the wood of the cross, and when the side of the one fixed to the cross was opened by the spear of the soldier, let him reflect whence the blood and water flowed, so that the church of God might be watered both by the bath of baptism and by the cup." Actually, I think the full statement shows you very clear that this is not only a Christological statement, but there's also an ecclesiological significance here. And so that because of the unity between the two natures of Christ, the bath of baptism and the church is being watered by the blood of Christ, and this blood is divine. This is a divine blood that we participate in. By the way, pop quiz, in what, right? What does this remind you of? The Eucharist, right? It reminds us of the Eucharist. So first of all, he's not separating the natures here, but he's kind of trying to speak in a very extreme way to refute Eutychianism. Not that alone is enough to kind of defend someone, because there is more defense, but he's trying to say, well, you can't observe the divine nature, right? And so when you look at who's being crucified, right, what do you see? A man, right? What does man mean? What does man signify? Human nature, right? And so that's the kind of point that he's trying to make here. And Leon's of Jerusalem, against the monophysite, kind of make the same argument. He says, if the word's flesh, by nature subject to passion, wasn't seen to be impassible as a result of union with him, so much the more has the word, by nature impassible, himself not become passible as a result of his union with the passible. Why then do you ask us, as though it were a matter of doubt, what kind of nature was nailed to the cross? Unless you're speaking of a natural divine suffering and not the suffering that's by appropriation, right? And so this is, I think, in essence, he's kind of saying the same thing as Christ suffered in his divine nature, in his human nature, right? He's basically saying that in a different way. So the summary of this page is Saint Leo's kind of questioning. You can kind of see that if you read the passage, he's kind of grilling Saint Flavian here. And he's kind of saying, why did you guys let this idiot speak? That's kind of his argument. And one of the arguments he makes is, it just doesn't make sense to me that you can speak of two natures before the union and then speak of one nature after the union. And uh, Price is making a very unfortunate commentary in footnote 68, where he kind of equivocates Eutychus' statement with the statement of Saint Cyril of Alexandria. Actually, Eutychus' statement, two natures before the union and one nature after union, even Severus rejects that, right? If you read I believe this is in the letters between Severus and Sergius. So Severus does not reject the statement that there are two natures, that Christ is out of two natures, right? But he does not accept the statement that there were two natures before the union. Um, and it sounds very nitpicky, but Severus's point is that if there were two natures before the union, then there was a human person before the union. So that's kind of his point. His point is that there was no human person before the union, therefore there cannot be two natures existing before the union. That's Severus's point basically. So and Eutychus, and he explicitly says that's Eutychus's argument. So it's actually valid to think that Saint Leo is actually referring to that argument as well, and that's what really confuses him, right? He explicitly says, "I profess that our late Lord was from two natures before the union, but after the union I profess one nature." Even monophysites reject this statement. If he didn't say two natures before the union and just said was from two natures, but after the union I profess one, then yes, this is a statement Saint Cyril made. This is a statement that monophysites make as well. That will not be disputed. So unfortunately, Price does not. Really does not understand the Christological disputes, which is very unfortunate. But I'm personally not really that surprised. It kind of sounds very. It sounds like a very dickish thing to say, but I'm not really surprised that he doesn't know much about it, because um, it's been more than a year or two that I lost all hope in academics. I think a lot of them don't really understand what they're talking about. 95% of them don't really get what they're trying to say, but that's the point that I want to make. So, I don't see why one should consider this as if he's attacking Saint Cyril. I don't see why someone should equivocate Saint Cyril's, and even honestly, even monophysites Christology with what Eutychus is saying here. I think what Saint Leo is saying is very explicitly, specifically towards Eutychus. Maybe he will make the same critique against Dioscorus as well. I'm not saying he wouldn't, right? But he will kind of make a different kind of an argument, right? He will supplement his argument with something else. I think that's kind of fair to expect that from him, because the kind of expectation is very uncharitable towards Saint Leo, I believe. And another point that I want to make that I think is very important as well, that it showcases that people in Constantinople were very hesitant, right? They were very hesitant to instantly condemn Eutychus, and that's because even Saint Flavian and Basil of Seleucia and all of these people that were, part of the Chalcedonian Confession in one way or another, right? Basil of Seleucia was one of the most important people who participated in writing the Chalcedonian definition. These people did not have any problems with one nature statement. So there is a genuine confusion from Saint Leo where he kind of asked, why do you guys think this is kind of okay? So that's kind of like another thing that's implied. But I think it's not controversial to state that Saint Flavian and the Constantinopolitans and Saint Leo are in agreement. And really, fundamentally speaking, Saint Cyril and Saint Leo and the Constantinopolitans are really in agreement once we kind of dive deep into the Christological matters. And this gets to the final page on the 23rd, I don't know, note or whatever you want to say. It states that after the reading of the aforesaid letter, the most devout bishops exclaimed, "This is the fate of the fathers. This is the fate of the apostles. We all believe accordingly. We Orthodox believe accordingly. Anathema to him who does not believe accordingly. Peter has uttered this through Leo," right? A Roman Catholic proof text here. "The apostles taught accordingly. Leo taught piously and truly. Cyril taught accordingly. Eternal is the memory of Cyril. Leo and Cyril taught the same." On the right side, you have a you have a quotation, I believe, from well, first of all, the right quotation is from Father John McGuckin's book on St. Cyril of Alexandria, the Christological Controversy, but he's really quoting from, give me a second here, then get the book. He's quoting from Defense of Chalcedon in the East. It's a very important book, and this book, the first, I believe, 15 pages of the book is about the Council of Chalcedon itself, right? Because the book is completely about how Chalcedon was defended, but Patrick Gray here makes a very, I think, a very, very critical analysis, and I think his insights are very, very good. Like, they're incredibly good, and I definitely agree with his insights generally, and I will most likely make a video on a lot of the things that he's saying. He states that much is usually made of the cry which greeted the reading of the tome. Actually, I'll read from Defense of the Gospel. Maybe there's some things that are different, but Patrick Gray says the reception accorded to Leo's tome yields more conclusive results. Much is usually made of the cry which greeted the reading of the tome. Saint Peter has spoken these things through Leo. It is often forgotten that that was not all that they said. They went on to say, Kirill so taught, eternal be the memory of Kirill. Leo and Kirill taught the same thing. This is the true faith. This is the faith of the fathers. It was indeed complimentary to suggest that the Bishop of Rome was living up to the reputation for orthodoxy of his see's founder, but it involved something more important than a compliment to compare Leo with Kirill. The obvious meaning of those exclamations is that the bishops accepted and praised Leo because he taught the same thing as Kirill. Kirill was the test for Christological orthodoxy, and Kirill alone. Any doubt on that point is dispelled by a reading of the records of the third session. Certain bishops were hesitant about accepting the tome because of the three troublesome passages, and he quotes them in Latin here. I could make myself look like a clown by reading the Latin. I'll just read one of the statements in Latin just to be a little funny, because we're approaching the end of the video, so we can be a little bit lighthearted here. Ut et mori posset ex uno et mori non posset ex altero, agit enim utraque forma en quamvis una persona sit aliud tamen estunde contumelia aliud unde gloria. So these are most of these things that I outlined. I mean, we dealt with these quotes anyway. He says, the obvious concern felt by these bishops was, of course, that such passages seem to imply a duality in the oneness of the subject of the incarnation, contrary to their own Cyrillian insistence on the single subject. And Aetius attempted to demonstrate the validity of such expressions in one way only, by comparing them to similar expressions used by Kirill. Thus, Leo's tome is again accepted by Chalcedon because it can be shown to be genuinely Cyrillian. Moreover, in order that lingering doubts might be set to rest conclusively, a period of 5 days was set aside specifically so that all of the bishops might compare the tome with Kirill's writings. A special commission under Anatolius was set up to do the same thing. All of this effort certainly shows that the bishops considered it as a matter of paramount importance that this statement of Latin Christology should have its faithfulness to Kirill demonstrated beyond a shadow of doubt. At the fourth session, when the commission had made its report in favor of Leo's orthodoxy, 161 bishops registered their individual opinions, all positive, and in almost every case included a specific affirmation of Leo's faithfulness to Kirill. Do you need me to read more of this, or does that make the point that I'm trying to make? I hope that makes the point that I'm trying to make. That this stupid argument that some Roman Catholic apologists make constantly over and over, that the Tome of Leo supposedly proves papal supremacy, is a joke. It's a complete and utter joke, and it showcases historical illiteracy and really the stupidity of the person making that argument. What we have seen here from the Tome of Leo, we have seen something that we don't generally see in apologetics. The Tome of Leo is not considered as a theological apologetical document according to a lot of moderns today, but it was always a apologetical document according to the church. But most importantly, it is a document that shall only be seen in context of St. Cyril's Christology. This fact itself proves that the Chalcedonian Council, first of all, was not based on what the Pope was saying, but it is fundamentally based on the Christology of Saint Cyril of Alexandria. This I think is one of the most fundamental lessons that one can read about the Council of Chalcedon and the subsequent ecumenical councils, because the fifth and the sixth councils are seen in context of, guess what, the Chalcedonian Council. And guess what, their ultimate fundamental presupposition is the Christology of Saint Cyril of Alexandria. Yes, that is the fundamental presupposition behind the third council, which Saint Cyril led, the fourth council, which Saint Cyril was vindicated, and the fifth and the sixth council, which was based on fundamentally on his Christology. So that I think should be enough to review the Tome of Leo. Enough of an analysis on the Tome of Leo. It's been an hour since this analysis has been an hour, but it's one of the most important documents in Christian history. An hour is quite a short time. People should be studying this text and studying the theology of this text, I think, much more deeply, because there's just so many things about this tome that's full of misinformation that a lot of people miss. And as I said, I am ready to debate. I'm ready to debate anyone on this document. I'm ready to debate the orthodoxy of this document. I have debated 3 monophysites on this document. Guess what? 3 of them didn't even make arguments based on this document. If you listen to the debate, they didn't even talk about Tome of Leo. But the Tome of Leo is one of the worst documents according to monophysites. So how can you be an Oriental and not talk about this document? I don't understand. I don't get it. It's like being Orthodox and being against the filioque, and then you don't even mention then you don't even care about the Latin Creed. You're like, oh well, I'm not going to debate you on the Creed. I'm just going to debate you on. It's silly, right? It's silly in my opinion. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay, but I hope this was helpful for you. I hope this was helpful for you to understand Orthodox Christology a little bit. I hope it was beneficial to you. If you want to learn kind of the basic stuff, I can recommend you to just read the Tome of Leo itself. But what I want to do is kind of analyze what the tome is about, what it's speaking of. Final note that I want to make that I kind of didn't emphasize enough in this video, actually. I think that you will see throughout the tome this kind of insistence of the forms, the natures having their own operations, right? Especially for each performs what is proper to it in communion with the other, the word achieving what is the words, while the body accomplishes what is the body's. So what Saint Leo, and I kind of talked about this before, but what Saint Leo is trying to get at here is that Christ has 2 forms, Christ has 2 natures, and these natures are have activities proper to them. So what he understands is that activity is part of form. It's not part of personhood, right? And so energy is proper to nature. And so it is the same person doing these activities, but these activities are proper to the nature. An example of this will be when Christ walks, or he talks, or he eats. The divine nature participates in that action, but these are human actions, right? A classic monophysite rebuttal, which is also fundamentally a monoenergist and monothelite argument, they will respond to this. In fact, they respond to this. Severus responds to this by saying, he kind of makes the argument from Leo. Says, well, Leo gives the example of Christ walking and then doing it on water. Well, we say that this is one operation, for it is only the nature of the word that can walk on water, right? Walking is not proper to the divine nature. Doing it on water is not proper to the human nature. And so he's kind of trying to express that there's only one energy, and so to kind of distinguish between 2 energies will render that such a thing impossible. And it's a very stupid argument. St. Maximus the Confessor responds to this very clearly. He speaks of theandric will and energy. And so the mode in which the will and energy exist, although they are 2, they exist in a theandric form. And so although there are 2 activities that are proper to their nature, these activities exist in unison, right? And they are not separated from each other in its activities. This is why yes, we do agree. Walking is not proper to the divine nature. Doing it on water is not proper to the human nature. Uh, this is why it is important that he has two of those activities working in communion with each other, as Saint Leo says, right? Each purpose what is proper to it in communion with the other. Severus fails to quote this part at times because he understands what Saint Leo is actually saying. I think that you can have that uh, theandric human divine activity, right? But an activity being theandric, right? If something is theandric, that means, and meaning it is divine human, that means there is something divine and that there is something human, meaning that there are two things that have become one in some form or capacity. Just like how God, being three persons, is one in some form or capacity, again, right? So we don't fall into these Hellenic presuppositions about plurality indicating division of some sorts or whatever, but rather we protect Orthodox presuppositions both in our triadology and Christology. And this is why, again, the Tome of Leo is so important because its presuppositions are inherently Orthodox. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you learned something from this, and I will see all of you in the next video. I am kind of busy these days. This is one of the few instances where I could have time to make this video, but next week I'm going to be making more videos, hopefully, God willing. So again, thank you for watching. If you like this, like, share, subscribe to the channel, all that jazz. Share this to your friends. Tell them, red pill them on the Tome of Leo. And I will see all of you in the next video. Goodbye, and may God be with you all. Thank you for watching.